Eleanor Whitmore's weathered hands trembled as she reached for the telephone, her eyes never leaving the four massive gray wolves positioned protectively around her living room. The SWAT sniper's red laser dot danced across her kitchen window. This wasn't supposed to be how her story ended. Outside, Sheriff Davidson's amplified voice cracked with disbelief. "Ma'am, we have reports of dangerous wild animals holding you hostage." The largest wolf, Hope, turned her amber eyes toward the window and released a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the floorboards. Eleanor's neighbors pressed against the police barricade, their faces pale with terror. The same woman who had taught their children to read was now surrounded by apex predators. Mrs. Patterson clutched her rosary, remembering how Eleanor used to bring homemade cookies to every PTA meeting. "Stand down," Eleanor called through the glass, her voice steady despite her racing heart. But how could she explain that these killers had traveled 200 miles through wilderness to save her life? And why would anyone believe that four wolves understood love better than most humans? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 years earlier, Eleanor Whitmore had learned that grief weighs exactly as much as 2 dinner plates. Every evening at 6 o'clock she would set the table for 2 out of pure habit, then stare at Robert's empty chair before quietly putting away the second plate, the unused fork, the coffee mug that read "World's Best Husband" in faded blue letters. The modest log cabin in Millbrook, Montana had been Robert's dream, 40 acres of pine forest where a retired postal worker and his elementary school teacher wife could watch deer graze in their backyard. Now it felt like a museum of memories too precious to disturb. His reading glasses still sat folded on the nightstand. His favorite flannel shirt hung in the closet, smelling faintly of Old Spice and sawdust. Eleanor's Social Security check of $847 arrived faithfully on the 3rd of each month, barely covering the mortgage payment Robert had insisted they could afford. "Don't worry, Ellie," he'd said, patting her hand. "My pension will take care of everything." What he hadn't mentioned was that postal worker pensions died with the worker. At 72, Eleanor had become an expert at stretching a dollar. Dinner came from a can more often than not. She'd traded her weekly hair appointments for home touch-ups with drugstore dye. The thermostat stayed at 62 degrees, even when November winds rattled the windows and frost painted delicate patterns on the glass. Her daughter Jessica called every Sunday from Seattle, her voice carrying the particular strain of a successful attorney juggling her own family. "Mom, you know you're always welcome here. The kids would love having Grandma around." But Eleanor knew what she really meant. "You're too old to live alone. You're becoming a burden we're not ready to carry." The loneliness had teeth. It gnawed at her during the long afternoons when the house creaked and settled around her like old bones. She talked to Robert's photograph on the mantel, telling him about her day, asking his advice about the leaky faucet or whether she should plant tomatoes again this spring. Sometimes she could almost hear his voice answering back. Former students would wave when they saw her at the grocery store, their own children in tow, but the conversations were brief and polite. "How are you holding up, Mrs. Whitmore?" they'd ask. And she'd smile and say, "Just fine, dear." Because what else could she say? That she sometimes forgot to eat because cooking for one felt pointless. That she'd started leaving the television on all night because the silence was too heavy. The church ladies brought casseroles occasionally, their good intentions wrapped in tinfoil and pity. Eleanor accepted them gracefully, knowing they meant well, knowing they saw her as they feared to become, the widow in the old cabin, measuring her days in episodes of Wheel of Fortune and crossword puzzles, waiting for phone calls that came less and less frequently. She had no way of knowing that salvation was about to arrive in the most unexpected form imaginable. The cardboard box appeared on Eleanor's front porch like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. It was 6:47 on a Tuesday morning in late September, and she'd stepped outside to retrieve the newspaper when she nearly tripped over it. The box was damp with dew, sagging slightly at the corners, with "Free Puppies" scrawled across the top in black marker. Eleanor's heart skipped as she heard the faint whimpering from inside. She knelt beside the box, her arthritic knees protesting against the wooden porch, and carefully lifted one of the flaps. 4 tiny creatures huddled together in the darkness, their eyes barely open, bodies trembling with cold and hunger. They couldn't have been more than 3 weeks old. "Oh, you poor little things," Eleanor whispered, her voice catching in her throat. The smallest one, a black female with distinctive white markings around her closed eyes, fit entirely in Eleanor's palm. Her breathing was shallow, her tiny ribs visible beneath dark fur. "Where's your mama?" A handwritten note was taped to the inside of the box. "Their mama got hit by a car yesterday. Please help them. I can't keep them." No signature, no phone number, just a desperate plea that tugged at Eleanor's maternal instincts with surprising force. Eleanor had always been a sucker for strays. During her teaching years, she'd rescued countless classroom hamsters, goldfish, and even a one-eyed cat that had taken up residence in the school cafeteria. Robert used to tease her about bringing home every wounded creature in the county. Eleanor's Ark, he'd called their garage, which had housed everything from baby birds to an injured raccoon. But this was different. These weren't just animals, they were babies who would die without immediate care. Eleanor could see it in their listless movements, hear it in their weak cries. Time was running out. She carried the box inside, her mind already racing through what she'd need. Puppy formula, bottles, heating pads, blankets. The nearest pet store was 47 miles away in Bozeman, and Eleanor's checking account held exactly $63.22 until her Social Security arrived next week. "Well, Robert," she said to his photograph, "looks like you sent me some company." The drive to Bozeman felt eternal. Eleanor had left the puppies wrapped in her warmest towels, nestled in a laundry basket beside the fireplace, but she worried about them with every mile. What if they were too weak? What if she was already too late? At the pet store, a young clerk with purple hair and kind eyes helped Eleanor gather supplies. Puppy formula, tiny bottles, heating pads, soft blankets, and wet food for when they were older. The total came to $89.47, exactly $26 more than Eleanor had. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, her cheeks burning with embarrassment as she removed items from her cart. "I didn't realize." The clerk looked at Eleanor's worn coat, her carefully mended purse, and made a decision. "You know what? We just had a return on some of this stuff. Manager said to mark it down." She typed rapidly on her register. "Totals $60 even." Eleanor knew it was charity, but the 4 tiny lives waiting at home mattered more than her pride. She paid with 3 $20 bills saved from her grocery money, knowing she'd be eating peanut butter sandwiches for the rest of the week. Back home, Eleanor transformed into a round-the-clock nurse. She mixed formula according to the package directions, testing the temperature on her wrist like she had when Jessica was a baby 35 years ago. The puppies' tiny mouths latched onto the bottles with desperate hunger, their eyes still sealed shut, operating on pure instinct. She fed them every 2 hours, setting her alarm clock throughout the night. During those quiet 2 a.m. feedings, with just the kitchen light glowing and the soft sounds of contented sucking, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Purpose. These creatures needed her. They depended on her completely, the way Jessica had once depended on her, the way Robert had depended on her during his final illness. The smallest puppy, the one she'd started calling Hope in her mind, was clearly the weakest. Several times during that first week, Eleanor was certain she'd lost her. But Hope was a fighter, clinging to life with a determination that reminded Eleanor of herself. As the days passed, Eleanor noticed things that seemed unusual. The puppy's ears were unusually pointed, their paws disproportionately large for their bodies. Their facial features seemed sharper than the golden retriever puppies she remembered from years past. But she dismissed her concerns. Mixed breeds could look unusual, and she'd never been an expert on dog genetics. What mattered was that they were thriving under her care, growing stronger each day, filling the silent house with new sounds of life. By November, Eleanor's puppies had tripled in size, and her grocery budget had become a mathematical impossibility. What started as $50 a week for puppy food had escalated to nearly $200 as four rapidly growing animals devoured everything she put in front of them. Eleanor found herself in the heartbreaking position of selling Robert's prized possessions, his vintage fishing reels, his collection of military medals, even his grandfather's pocket watch, just to keep up with their appetites. The creatures she'd named Hope, Faith, Grace, and Mercy no longer resembled any dog breed Eleanor had ever seen. Hope, still the smallest, stood nearly 2 feet tall at the shoulder. Her siblings towered even higher, their legs long and powerful, their heads distinctly wedge-shaped with ears that stood perpetually erect. Their yellow eyes held an intelligence that sometimes unsettled Eleanor, as if they understood far more than they should. "Those aren't dogs, Eleanor," her neighbor Betty Walsh said bluntly during one of her increasingly frequent visits. Betty stood at the kitchen window, watching Grace effortlessly leap onto the 6-foot fence surrounding Eleanor's backyard. "Dogs don't move like that. Dogs don't look like that." Eleanor's hands trembled as she poured coffee, trying to ignore the truth that had been growing more obvious each day. "They're just mixed breeds, Betty. Maybe part German Shepherd, part wolf," Betty finished, her voice carrying a mixture of fear and concern. "Eleanor, honey, you need to face facts here. Those animals could kill you." The word wolf hung in the air like a curse. Eleanor had suspected it for weeks, but hearing it spoken aloud made it terrifyingly real. Wolves were dangerous. Wolves were illegal to own. Wolves belonged in the wilderness, not in an elderly woman's living room. That afternoon, Eleanor made an appointment with Dr. Martinez, the only veterinarian within 50 miles. She loaded all 4 animals into Robert's old pickup truck, their size now requiring the entire truck bed. During the 20-minute drive to town, she rehearsed her story. Mixed breed rescues, needed shots and health checks, perfectly normal domestic animals. Dr. Martinez took one look at the 4 creatures and stepped backward, his face pale. "Mrs. Whitmore, I can't examine these animals. They're just puppies," Eleanor insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. "They need their vaccinations." "Ma'am, these are gray wolves, Canis lupus. I'd stake my veterinary license on it." Dr. Martinez kept his distance, his eyes never leaving the animals. "You need to contact Fish and Wildlife Services immediately. Keeping wild animals without proper permits is a federal crime." Eleanor's world tilted. "That's impossible. Someone left them on my porch. They were dying." "I saved them." "I understand your attachment, but these animals will grow to weigh over 100 pounds each. Their bite force can crush bones. When they reach sexual maturity, their pack instincts will override any domestic training." Dr. Martinez softened his tone. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've known you for years. You're a good woman, but you're in over your head. These wolves need to be in a proper facility." The drive home passed in a blur of panic and denial. Eleanor's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. In the rearview mirror, she could see Hope watching her with those impossibly intelligent eyes, as if sensing her distress. 2 days later, a white government SUV pulled into Eleanor's driveway. Sarah Chen, a wildlife biologist with the Montana Fish Wildlife Parks Department, emerged carrying an official clipboard and wearing an expression of professional concern. "Mrs. Whitmore, we've received reports that you're harboring wild animals without proper permits. Sarah's voice was kind but firm. I need to assess the situation and ensure public safety. Eleanor led Sarah to the backyard, where all 4 wolves were sunning themselves on the wooden deck Robert had built. At nearly 6 months old, they were unmistakably wild animals, magnificent, powerful, and utterly out of place in a suburban setting. Sarah pulled out her phone and snapped several photographs. These are definitely gray wolves, Mrs. Whitmore. They appear healthy and well cared for, but I'm afraid I have to issue a formal notice. You have 72 hours to surrender these animals to state custody. 72 hours? Eleanor's voice cracked. What will happen to them? They'll be evaluated for placement in an accredited wildlife facility. If no placement is available, Sarah paused, clearly uncomfortable. Given that they've been habituated to humans, euthanasia may be the most humane option. The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. After months of round-the-clock care, after watching them grow from helpless infants to magnificent creatures, the government wanted to take them away and possibly kill them. The injustice of it burned in her chest. These animals saved my life, Eleanor said quietly. After my husband died, I had nothing to live for. Taking care of them gave me purpose again. I understand your emotional attachment, but no, you don't understand. Eleanor's voice grew stronger. For 3 years I've been waiting to die. These creatures reminded me what it feels like to be needed. They've never shown aggression toward me or anyone else. They're not dangerous. They're family. Sarah's expression softened, but her resolve remained firm. Mrs. Whitmore, I have children. I can't ignore the public safety risk. One attack, one incident, and someone could die. I won't have that on my conscience. That evening, Eleanor sat on her porch surrounded by the 4 wolves, watching the sun set behind the Montana mountains. Hope rested her massive head on Eleanor's lap, while Faith, Grace, and Mercy formed a protective circle around her chair. They seemed to sense the impending separation, their behavior more attentive than usual. I won't let them take you, Eleanor whispered into Hope's fur. I don't know how, but I'll find a way. The 72-hour countdown had begun, and Eleanor Whitmore was about to discover reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. Within hours of Sarah Chen's visit, Eleanor's quiet life exploded into chaos. Jessica arrived from Seattle unannounced, her rental car screeching into the driveway at nearly midnight. Eleanor's daughter burst through the front door, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floors, her face a mask of barely controlled panic. "Mother, what the hell are you thinking?" Jessica's voice echoed through the cabin as she stared at the 4 massive wolves lounging in the living room. Grace lifted her head from the couch, Robert's old recliner, and regarded the newcomer with calm yellow eyes. I got a call from some government officials saying you're harboring dangerous wild animals. Do you have any idea what kind of liability you're facing? Eleanor remained seated in her kitchen chair, her coffee growing cold. At 72, she'd learned that staying calm often unnerved people more than shouting back. They're not dangerous, Jessica. They've lived here for 8 months without incident. Not dangerous? Jessica's voice pitched higher. Mom, those are wolves, actual wolves. They could kill you in your sleep. They sleep at the foot of my bed every night, Eleanor replied quietly. If they wanted to hurt me, I'd already be dead. Jessica pulled out her phone, scrolling frantically through her contacts. I'm calling Dr. Peterson. You clearly need a psychological evaluation. This is elder abuse, Mom. You're abusing yourself. The accusation stung more than Eleanor expected. I'm perfectly sane, and I'm certainly not abusing myself. These animals needed help, and I provided it, just like I provided help to dozens of stray cats, injured birds, and abandoned pets over the years. You never objected then. Those were house cats, not apex predators. Jessica's professional composure cracked completely. Mom, I haven't seen you since Dad's funeral 3 years ago because you insisted you were fine alone. Now I find out you're living in some bizarre wildlife sanctuary situation that could get you killed or arrested. How is any of this fine? Eleanor felt the familiar pang of guilt that came whenever Jessica mentioned Robert's funeral. The truth was, she'd pushed her daughter away because seeing Jessica's life, successful career, loving husband, beautiful children, reminded Eleanor too painfully of everything she'd lost. It was easier to pretend independence than admit devastation. I am fine, Eleanor insisted, though her voice wavered slightly. For the first time in 3 years, I have a reason to get up in the morning. Meanwhile, word of Eleanor's situation spread through Millbrook like wildfire. The small town split into 2 distinct camps almost overnight. Team Eleanor consisted primarily of her former students, now adults with children of their own, who remembered her kindness and dedication during their elementary school years. They organized on Facebook, sharing childhood memories of how Mrs. Whitmore had stayed after school to help struggling readers, how she'd spent her own money on classroom supplies, how she'd never missed a school play or talent show. Mrs. Whitmore saved my education, posted David Chen, Sarah's younger brother and one of Eleanor's former students. I was dyslexic, and she spent countless hours helping me learn to read. If she says these wolves are safe, I believe her. Team Opposition rallied around Marcus Blackwood, a local hunting guide whose voice carried significant weight in the rural community. Marcus organized town hall meetings, circulated petitions, and spoke passionately about the dangers of allowing wild predators in residential areas. This isn't about sentiment, Marcus argued at a packed meeting in the high school gymnasium. This is about public safety. Wolves are apex predators. They've evolved to hunt and kill. One day, Mrs. Whitmore's luck is going to run out, and someone's going to get hurt. Maybe her, maybe a child walking by her property. Are we really willing to take that risk for one lonely old woman's fantasy? The cruel dismissal of Eleanor as a lonely old woman sparked outrage among her supporters, but Marcus's safety arguments resonated with parents and elderly residents. The town council scheduled an emergency meeting to address the situation, effectively putting Eleanor's fate to a public vote. As the controversy escalated, Eleanor discovered she had an unexpected ally. Tom Running Bear, a member of the nearby Blackfeet Nation Tribal Council, arrived at her cabin on a snowy January morning. A man in his 60s with graying braids and weathered hands, Tom listened quietly as Eleanor told her story. My grandfather always said that wolves choose their pack, Tom said finally, watching Faith demonstrate her unusual habit of turning off light switches with her nose. They don't serve humans. They partner with those they consider worthy. This is unusual, but not unheard of in our traditions. Tom explained that Eleanor's property sat partially on land that fell under tribal jurisdiction due to an old treaty boundary dispute. If Eleanor was willing to deed her property to the tribe and lease it back, the wolves could potentially be protected under tribal sovereignty laws that superseded state wildlife regulations. It's not a guarantee, Tom warned, but it might buy you time to find a permanent solution. The legal maneuvering gave Eleanor hope, but it also intensified the opposition. Marcus Blackwood began appearing at Eleanor's property boundary almost daily, ostensibly checking fence lines on the adjacent public land. He'd stand just outside her property, staring at the house, making notes in a small notebook. Sometimes he'd park his truck across the road and sit there for hours, his presence clearly intended to intimidate. Eleanor's mail began including anonymous letters with increasingly threatening language. "Those monsters need to go," read one note written in red ink, "before someone gets hurt." Another contained gruesome photographs of livestock attacks from wolf incidents in other states, with a handwritten message, "This could be your neighbor's children." The psychological warfare took its toll. Eleanor found herself jumping at unexpected sounds, constantly checking the locks on her doors and windows. The wolves sensed her anxiety and responded by becoming more protective, following her from room to room, positioning themselves between her and any perceived threats. Dr. Rebecca Stone, a renowned wolf behaviorist from the University of Montana, requested permission to observe Eleanor's pack for her research. A woman in her 40s with short gray hair and intense blue eyes, Dr. Stone had studied wolf behavior across North America for over 20 years. "What you've achieved here is unprecedented," Dr. Stone told Eleanor after spending a week documenting the wolves' behavior. "I've never seen wild wolves integrate so completely with a human while maintaining their pack structure. Hope clearly views you as the alpha, but she also maintains authority over her siblings. It's remarkable." Dr. Stone's observations revealed the sophisticated social dynamics Eleanor had intuitively understood. The wolves had established territories within the house. Grace controlled the kitchen and dining area, Mercy claimed the living room, Faith dominated the bedrooms, and Hope moved freely throughout all spaces, maintaining order among her siblings. "They're not pets," Dr. Stone explained in her preliminary report. "They're exhibiting classic pack behavior, but they've incorporated you into their social structure in a way that challenges everything we thought we knew about wolf-human relationships." The scientific validation gave Eleanor ammunition for the legal battle, but it also attracted unwanted attention. Wildlife photographers began camping outside her property with telephoto lenses. News crews from regional television stations arrived weekly, turning her quiet road into a media circus. The pressure intensified when Eleanor's financial situation reached a crisis point. Legal fees for fighting the seizure order had drained her meager savings. The costs of feeding 4 wolves had forced her to skip meals regularly, and she'd lost noticeable weight. Her mortgage payments had fallen 3 months behind, and the bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings. Jessica, despite her disapproval of the wolf situation, hired a family attorney to help with the financial crisis. "I can't support your decision to keep these animals," Jessica told her mother during one of their increasingly frequent phone arguments, "but I won't let you lose Dad's house." The most disturbing development came in late February, when Eleanor discovered evidence that someone had been on her property at night. Footprints in the snow led from the road to various vantage points around her house. Security cameras Jessica had installed captured shadowy figures moving through the trees, but the footage was too unclear to identify specific individuals. One morning, Eleanor found a dead rabbit hanging from her mailbox with a note attached. "Wild animals belong in the wild. Stop this before someone gets hurt." The crude gallows construction and the blood-stained message represented a clear escalation from anonymous letters to direct threats. The wolves' reaction to the increased threats was telling. They became more vigilant, taking turns standing guard at windows throughout the night. Hope began sleeping directly across Eleanor's bedroom doorway, effectively blocking access to her. When strangers approached the property, all 4 wolves would position themselves between the threat and Eleanor, their body language unmistakably protective but not aggressive. Eleanor realized that her fight to save the wolves had evolved into something much larger. This wasn't just about 4 animals anymore. It was about her right to make her own choices, about the community's fear of wildness, about the complex relationship between humans and nature in modern America. As winter deepened and the legal deadline approached, Eleanor prepared for the battle of her life, surrounded by 4 creatures who had already proven they would risk everything to protect the woman who had given them a second chance at life. September 15, 2022 marked exactly 1 year since Eleanor had found 4 helpless wolf cubs on her doorstep. It would also mark the day everything changed forever. The final state deadline loomed at midnight, 12 hours for Eleanor to surrender the wolves voluntarily or face forced removal by a specialized wildlife team equipped with tranquilizer guns and federal warrants. Eleanor sat on her front porch in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the four magnificent creatures who had transformed from helpless infants into powerful predators without losing their devotion to the woman who had saved them. Hope, now weighing nearly 90 pounds, rested her massive head on Eleanor's lap, while Faith, Grace, and Mercy formed their usual protective semicircle around her chair. "Well, girls," Eleanor whispered, scratching Hope behind the ears, "this might be our last morning together." The financial pressure had reached a breaking point. The foreclosure notice taped to her front door gave her 30 days to vacate the property Robert had built with his own hands. Legal fees had consumed her life savings, and the cost of feeding 4 wolves had forced her to rely on food banks for her own meals. Eleanor had lost nearly 20 pounds over the past month, her clothes hanging loose on her diminishing frame. But the physical and financial pressures paled compared to the emotional weight of the decision she faced. Jessica had presented her with an ultimatum during their last phone conversation. "Mom, if you surrender the wolves voluntarily, I'll pay off the mortgage and move you to Seattle. You can live with us, be part of our family again. But I won't watch you destroy yourself over these animals." The offer was generous, too generous to refuse rationally. Eleanor would have financial security, family support, and medical care as she aged. All she had to do was give up the 4 creatures who had brought meaning back to her life. At 8 a.m., the media circus began. News vans lined the rural road leading to Eleanor's property, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like technological trees. Reporters conducted live broadcasts from her front gate, framing the story as a David versus Goliath battle between an elderly woman and government bureaucracy. "This is Amanda Rodriguez reporting live from Millbrook, Montana, where 72-year-old Eleanor Whitmore faces an impossible choice," announced a CNN correspondent, her voice carrying across the property. "Surrender the 4 wolves she's raised from cubs or face federal charges for violating wildlife protection laws." By noon, supporters had organized a candlelight vigil that attracted over 300 people from across the state. They held signs reading "Save Eleanor's Pack" and "Wolves choose love over fear." Former students, now adults with children of their own, shared stories about Mrs. Whitmore's kindness and dedication during their school years. "She taught me that every creature deserves a chance," said Maria Santos, now a nurse practitioner addressing the gathered crowd. These wolves were dying when she found them. She chose compassion over convenience, love over law. That's the Eleanor Whitmore I remember. But the opposition had organized as well. Marcus Blackwood arrived with a counter-protest of ranchers, hunters, and residents who viewed Eleanor's wolves as a dangerous precedent. They carried signs reading "Public safety first" and "Wild animals aren't pets." Marcus stood on the bed of his pickup truck, addressing his supporters through a megaphone. "This isn't about sentiment," Marcus shouted, his voice echoing across the property. "This is about precedent. If we let one person keep wild predators as pets, where does it end? Bears? Mountain lions? How many people have to die before we say enough?" The 2 groups faced each other across the narrow country road, their chants and counter-chants creating a cacophony that had the wolves pacing nervously inside the house. Eleanor watched from her kitchen window, overwhelmed by the circus her quiet life had become. At 3 p.m., Dr. Rebecca Stone arrived with devastating news. Her week-long behavioral study had been completed, and while it confirmed the unprecedented nature of Eleanor's relationship with the wolves, it also revealed troubling information that could not be ignored. "Eleanor, I need to show you something." Dr. Stone said, her expression grave as she spread photographs across the kitchen table. These are images from trail cameras I placed around your property. Look at the timestamps. The photographs showed all 4 wolves leaving Eleanor's property at night, moving through the forest in coordinated hunting patterns. They had killed deer, elk, and smaller game with the efficiency of truly wild predators. Most disturbing were images showing them near residential areas on the outskirts of town. They're not fully domesticated, Dr. Stone explained carefully. They view you as their pack leader, but their hunting instincts are intact. When you're asleep, they're behaving like wild wolves. It's only a matter of time before they encounter hikers, campers, or children. Eleanor stared at the photographs, her world tilting. She had believed, wanted to believe, that love and kindness had transformed these creatures into something safe. But the evidence showed that beneath their gentle behavior toward her lay the unchanged heart of apex predators. "What are you saying?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew. "I'm saying that as much as they love you, they're still wild animals. The safest place for them and for this community is a professional wildlife facility where they can live as wolves without endangering humans." As afternoon faded into evening, Eleanor made her most difficult decision since Robert's death. She called Sarah Chen and agreed to surrender the wolves voluntarily at 8 p.m., giving her time to say goodbye privately before the media chaos resumed. But Marcus Blackwood had other plans. At 7:30 p.m., as Eleanor sat in her living room surrounded by the 4 wolves for what she believed might be the last time, headlights blazed through her front windows. Marcus's pickup truck roared into her driveway, and the man himself emerged carrying a high-powered rifle. "This ends tonight," Marcus shouted, his voice carrying across the property to where news crews scrambled to capture the unfolding drama. "I'm not waiting for bureaucrats to solve this problem." Eleanor's heart hammered as she recognized the look in Marcus's eyes, the same desperate fury she'd seen in bereaved parents, the same helpless rage that comes from loss beyond comprehension. This wasn't about public safety anymore. This was personal. "Marcus, please," Eleanor called through her front door, her voice steady despite her terror. "I've already agreed to surrender them. The state officials are coming in 30 minutes. 30 minutes too late," Marcus replied, raising his rifle. "These monsters should have been put down months ago." Hope sensed the threat immediately. The alpha female positioned herself between Eleanor and the front door, her massive frame blocking any clear shot. Faith, Grace, and Mercy flanked their leader, forming an impenetrable wall of muscle and protective instinct. "They're protecting me," Eleanor said, more to herself than to Marcus. "They know you want to hurt me." Marcus's finger moved to the trigger. "Get away from them, Mrs. Whitmore. I don't want to hurt you, but those animals are going to die tonight." What happened next would be replayed on news broadcasts across the nation. Instead of cowering or fleeing, Hope did something that defied every expectation about wild animal behavior. The massive wolf walked calmly to the front door, sat down facing Marcus through the glass, and began what could only be described as a purposeful display of non-aggression. She lowered her head, exposed her throat, and maintained eye contact with the man who wanted to kill her. It was a gesture of submission and trust that no wild wolf would ever make toward a threatening human. The rifle wavered in Marcus's hands as he stared into Hope's intelligent yellow eyes. For a moment that felt like eternity, predator and human regarded each other across the thin barrier of glass and years of accumulated fear. Then Marcus began to tremble, and the carefully constructed wall of his rage finally crumbled. The rifle slipped from Marcus Blackwood's trembling hands, clattering onto the wooden porch with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire valley. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto Eleanor's front steps, his face buried in his hands as 20 years of suppressed grief finally erupted. I couldn't save her, Marcus sobbed, his voice breaking like a dam under impossible pressure. I was supposed to protect my little girl, and I failed. I failed Emma. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Through the glass door she watched this broken man, the same person who had terrorized her for months, transform into something she recognized, a father destroyed by loss. Hope remained motionless, still sitting in her position of vulnerable trust, as if she understood that this moment required absolute stillness. "Marcus," Eleanor said softly, opening the door despite every instinct screaming at her to stay protected. "What happened to Emma?" The story poured out of him in jagged fragments. Emma Blackwood, 7 years old, blonde pigtails and gap-toothed smile, had been Marcus's entire world after his wife died in childbirth. He'd raised her alone, a single father doing his best with bedtime stories and braided hair and packed lunches shaped like hearts. 5 years ago, Marcus had taken Emma on what was supposed to be a simple camping trip in Glacier National Park. They'd hiked the easy trails, roasted marshmallows, and counted stars from their tent. On the final morning, while Marcus packed their gear, Emma had wandered just 30 yards away to pick wildflowers for her teacher. That's when the wolves found her. "I heard her scream," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant hum of news cameras. "By the time I got there, it was too late. 3 wolves, maybe 4. They scattered when they saw me, but Emma—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth as the full weight of Marcus's trauma became clear. For 5 years, he'd been carrying the unbearable knowledge that he'd failed to protect the most precious thing in his life. Every time he saw hope, faith, grace, and mercy, he saw the creatures that had murdered his daughter. "The state officials told me it was nobody's fault," Marcus continued, his words tumbling over each other. "Just a tragic encounter with wild animals? But I knew the truth. I let my guard down. I let her wander away. I failed as a father." Hope slowly rose from her sitting position and took a tentative step toward Marcus. Eleanor held her breath, uncertain whether the wolf sensed vulnerability or threat. But Hope's body language remained non-aggressive as she approached the grieving man, her movements deliberate and careful. "She's not going to hurt you," Eleanor said, though she wasn't entirely certain herself. "Hope, come back here." But Hope ignored Eleanor's command, the first time she'd ever done so. Instead, the massive wolf moved closer to Marcus until she was within arm's reach. Then she did something that defied every principle of predator behavior. She lay down beside him, resting her head near his feet in a gesture of comfort that seemed impossibly human in its empathy. Marcus looked up, tears streaming down his weathered face, and stared into the yellow eyes of the creature he'd blamed for his daughter's death. "Why?" he whispered. "Why are you—" Eleanor found herself moving toward them both, drawn by an intuition she couldn't explain. "Marcus, Hope wasn't there when Emma died. None of my wolves were there. They were just babies when I found them." "It doesn't matter," Marcus said bitterly. "They're all the same. Killers. Predators. They take everything you love and leave you with nothing." "No," Eleanor said firmly, kneeling beside Hope and placing her hand on the wolf's massive head. "Hope gave me back everything I thought I'd lost. She gave me purpose, love, a reason to wake up every morning, just like Emma gave you those things." As if responding to her name, Hope lifted her head and looked directly at Marcus. In that moment, something shifted in the man's expression. The raw hatred that had consumed him for months began to crack, revealing the grief underneath. "Emma loved animals," Marcus said quietly, his voice thick with memory. "She wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. She used to rescue baby birds that fell from their nests. nurse them back to health in shoeboxes lined with cotton balls. Eleanor felt tears sliding down her own cheeks. She sounds like she was a beautiful little girl. She was everything, Marcus whispered. And when those wolves killed her, they killed me too. I've been walking around dead for 5 years, just looking for something to blame, something to hate, something to make the pain stop. News crews had stopped filming, their cameras lowering as they witnessed something too intimate for broadcast. The gathered crowds, both supporters and protesters, had fallen silent, sensing that this moment transcended their political divisions. Hope remained motionless beside Marcus, her presence somehow radiating the kind of peace that Eleanor had felt during those quiet midnight feedings when the cubs were tiny. It was the peace of unconditional acceptance, of love that asks nothing in return. "I can't bring Emma back," Eleanor said gently. "And killing my wolves won't bring her back either. But maybe, just maybe, we can find a way to honor her memory that doesn't require destroying something beautiful." Marcus reached out with a shaking hand and touched Hope's fur, his fingers barely making contact. The wolf didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, she pressed slightly into his touch, the way she did when Eleanor petted her. "I don't know how to stop hating," Marcus admitted. "The anger is all I have left of her." "The anger isn't all you have," Eleanor said softly. "You have her love for animals. You have her kindness. You have her memory. Those wolves that killed Emma, they were just being wolves. They weren't evil. They were just following their nature. Just like Hope is following hers right now." As if to emphasize Eleanor's point, Hope shifted closer to Marcus and rested her head against his leg. The gesture was so gentle, so trusting, that Marcus broke down completely, his shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the very core of his being. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though it wasn't clear whether he was apologizing to Eleanor, to Hope, or to the memory of his daughter. "I'm so sorry." Eleanor placed her hand on Marcus's shoulder, and for several minutes, the three of them, woman, man, and wolf, formed an unlikely tableau of shared grief and tentative healing. Around them, the media circus continued, but the center of their small circle had become a sacred space where pain could finally begin to transform into something else. But their moment of peace was shattered by the sound of approaching sirens. The state wildlife team had arrived for the scheduled surrender, and with them came the stark reminder that despite this breakthrough, Eleanor still faced losing the creatures who had become her family. The real crisis was just beginning. The convoy of state vehicles descended Eleanor's driveway like a mechanical storm, their flashing lights painting the gathering dusk in alternating reds and blues. Sarah Chen emerged from the lead SUV, followed by a specialized wildlife team equipped with tranquilizer guns, transport cages, and the cold efficiency of bureaucracy. Behind them came additional law enforcement officers, their presence transforming Eleanor's property into what felt like a crime scene. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sarah called out, her voice carrying the weight of official duty despite her obvious reluctance, "I need you to secure the animals inside the house while we prepare for transport." Eleanor remained kneeling beside Marcus and Hope, her hand still resting on the wolf's massive head. The other 3 wolves had positioned themselves in a protective formation around their small group, their yellow eyes tracking the movements of the armed officials with predatory awareness. "Give me 5 more minutes," Eleanor called back, her voice steadier than she felt. "Marcus needs medical attention." It was a stalling tactic, and everyone knew it. But Marcus's emotional breakdown had been so complete, so raw, that even the hardened wildlife officers hesitated to interrupt what appeared to be a genuine crisis. Dr. Rebecca Stone approached cautiously, her scientific mind clearly racing to understand the unprecedented scene before her. "Eleanor, I've never seen anything like this." Hope's behavior toward Marcus contradicts everything we know about wolf responses to threats. Maybe that's because she doesn't see him as a threat anymore, Eleanor replied, watching as Hope continued to rest peacefully against Marcus's leg. Maybe she sees what I see, a man who's been carrying unbearable pain for too long. Sarah Chen checked her watch, clearly torn between compassion and duty. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand this is difficult, but we have our orders. The wolves need to be secured and transported tonight. That's when Marcus Blackwood did something that shocked everyone present, including himself. The man who had terrorized Eleanor for months, who had arrived with a rifle intending to kill her wolves, slowly stood up and positioned himself between the state officials and Hope. "No," Marcus said quietly, his voice hoarse from crying but carrying unexpected authority. "You're not taking them." Sarah blinked in surprise. "Sir, you need to step aside. These animals are being removed for public safety." "Public safety?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "I've spent 5 years thinking these animals were monsters because wolves killed my daughter. 5 years planning revenge, spreading fear, trying to destroy Eleanor's life. But looking at this wolf right now, seeing how she responded to my pain," he paused, his voice breaking slightly. "I was wrong. I was so wrong." The gathered crowd, news crews, protesters, supporters, fell silent as Marcus continued. "Emma, my little girl, she would have loved these wolves. She would have seen what I was too blind to see, that they're not monsters, they're just animals trying to survive, trying to protect the person who saved them." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as she watched Marcus's transformation. 5 minutes ago, he'd been her greatest enemy. Now he stood as her unlikely ally, his body shielding Hope from the tranquilizer guns. "Sir, you're interfering with a federal wildlife operation," one of the officers warned, moving his hand to his sidearm. "Then arrest me," Marcus replied simply, "because I'm not moving." The standoff intensified as more of Eleanor's supporters began moving closer to the house, forming a human barrier between the wolves and the state team. Former students, church members, and animal rights activists linked arms, creating a protective wall around Eleanor's property. Jessica Whitmore chose that moment to arrive from the airport, her rental car screeching to a halt behind the state vehicles. Eleanor watched her daughter emerge, expecting another confrontation about surrendering the wolves and moving to Seattle. Instead, Jessica walked directly to Eleanor and embraced her fiercely. "Mom, I'm sorry," Jessica whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been watching the news coverage from the airport. I saw what just happened with that man, saw how the wolves protected you. I was wrong to ask you to give them up." Eleanor pulled back in shock. "Jessica, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I've been trying to protect you from the wrong things," Jessica replied, wiping tears from her eyes. "I was so worried about your physical safety that I forgot about your emotional survival. These wolves aren't endangering your life, they're giving you a reason to live." Dr. Stone stepped forward, her scientific objectivity warring with what she'd witnessed. "Sarah, I need to request a delay in the transport order. The behavioral data I'm collecting here could revolutionize our understanding of wolf-human relationships. This pack has demonstrated cognitive empathy, emotional intelligence, and social adaptation that challenges fundamental assumptions about wildlife behavior." "Dr. Stone, I appreciate your research interests, but I have direct orders from the governor's office," interrupted a new voice. Tom Running Bear approached the group, flanked by 2 tribal council members and carrying an official-looking document. "This is a temporary injunction issued under tribal sovereignty rights. Mrs. Whitmore's property deed has been transferred to the Blackfeet Nation as of 1 hour ago. These wolves are now under tribal protection." Sarah Chen's face flushed with frustration. "Mr. Running Bear, you can't just—" "I can, and I have," Tom replied calmly. The federal government recognizes tribal sovereignty over wildlife management on reservation lands. These wolves are now protected under tribal law until a proper hearing can be held. The legal maneuvering bought time, but Eleanor knew it was only a temporary reprieve. More importantly, she realized that her fight had grown beyond just saving 4 wolves. It had become a symbol of something larger, the right of individuals to choose love over fear, compassion over convention. As the state officials reluctantly retreated to reassess their legal options, Eleanor found herself surrounded by an unlikely alliance. Marcus, still shaky from his emotional breakdown, had become her most vocal defender. Jessica was making phone calls to media contacts, ensuring that Eleanor's story reached a national audience. Dr. Stone was documenting everything, building a scientific case for the wolves' unprecedented behavior. But it was Tom Running Bear who delivered the most startling revelation of the evening. "Eleanor," he said quietly, drawing her aside as the chaos swirled around them. "There's something you need to know about your husband, Robert. Something that might explain why these wolves bonded with you so completely." Eleanor's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" Tom pulled out a faded photograph from his jacket pocket. It showed a younger Robert in outdoor gear, kneeling beside a wolf den with several cubs visible in the background. "Your husband wasn't just a postal worker, Eleanor. For the last 15 years of his life, he was secretly working with our tribal wildlife program, helping to reintroduce wolves to their native habitat." The world tilted beneath Eleanor's feet. "That's impossible. Robert never mentioned—" "He couldn't," Tom explained gently. "The work was controversial, even dangerous. There were threats, attempts at sabotage. Robert insisted on keeping his involvement secret to protect you, but these cubs, they're descendants of the wolves he helped save." Eleanor stared at the photograph, recognizing Robert's gentle smile, his careful positioning that wouldn't threaten the wolf family. Suddenly, so many pieces fell into place: his unexplained absences on weekends, his detailed knowledge of animal behavior, his insistence on moving to this particular property on the edge of the wilderness. "The cubs found their way to you because this was their ancestral territory," Tom continued. "Robert chose this location specifically because it was a traditional wolf denning site. In a way, they came home." As Eleanor processed this revelation, Hope approached and nuzzled against her leg, as if sensing her emotional turmoil. The wolf's touch grounded her, reminding her that regardless of the complicated truths about Robert's secret life, the love between her and these wolves was real, immediate, and worth fighting for. The battle was far from over, but Eleanor now understood that she wasn't just fighting for 4 wolves. She was fighting to complete her husband's life work, to honor his memory in the most meaningful way possible. The stakes had never been higher, and the real revelation was yet to come. 5 years later, Eleanor Whitmore stood on the observation deck of the Whitmore Running Bear Wolf Sanctuary, watching Hope teach her 3 cubs the intricate social dynamics that had made their pack famous worldwide. At 77, Eleanor moved more slowly than she once had, her arthritis making morning walks challenging, but her eyes still sparkled with the same fierce determination that had saved 4 helpless wolf cubs from certain death. The sanctuary now sprawled across 200 acres of Montana wilderness, a collaborative effort between the Blackfeet Nation, the University of Montana's Wildlife Research Program, and private donors whose contributions had poured in after Eleanor's story captured international attention. The modest cabin where it all began had been expanded into a research center, visitor education facility, and Eleanor's comfortable retirement home. "Grandma Eleanor, look!" called 8-year-old Emma Blackwood, Marcus's adopted daughter who bore the name of the child he'd lost but carried the bright future he'd found. Emma pressed her face against the reinforced glass of the observation window, watching Hope's cubs practice hunting techniques on enrichment toys. "Hope is teaching them how to work together. Marcus approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. His transformation from broken adversary to devoted sanctuary manager still miraculous to witness 5 years later. His weathered face bore the scars of his grief, but also the peace that comes from finding purpose in healing rather than hatred. "She's a natural teacher," Marcus said, handing Eleanor her coffee, "just like someone else I know." The sanctuary had become more than a home for wolves. It had evolved into a living laboratory that challenged everything scientists thought they knew about predator behavior and human-animal relationships. Dr. Rebecca Stone, now the facility's research director, had documented behaviors that appeared in journals worldwide and revolutionized wildlife management practices across North America. "The mother-cub communication patterns we've observed here don't exist anywhere else in the literature," Dr. Stone explained to a group of visiting researchers from Europe. "Hope's pack demonstrates cognitive empathy, complex problem-solving, and social adaptation that suggests wolves are capable of far more sophisticated relationships with humans than we ever imagined." Eleanor smiled as she watched the visiting scientists scribble notes frantically, trying to capture the magic of what had become routine at the sanctuary. Hope's descendants, now 3 generations strong, displayed the same remarkable ability to form bonds with humans while maintaining their essential wildness. The pack had grown to 15 wolves, making it one of the most successful captive breeding programs in the world. Jessica arrived for her weekly visit, her law practice now specializing in wildlife protection legislation inspired by her mother's fight. She brought her own children, 10-year-old Michael and 6-year-old Sarah, who had grown up considering the wolves extended family members. "Mom, I have news," Jessica said, settling beside Eleanor on the deck. "The Montana legislature passed the Whitmore Act yesterday. It establishes legal protections for educational wildlife facilities and creates guidelines for human-animal research partnerships." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "Robert would be so proud." "He would be," Jessica agreed, squeezing her mother's hand. "But I think he'd be even prouder of what you've accomplished here. You didn't just save 4 wolves, you changed how the world thinks about the relationship between humans and wildlife." The educational programs at the sanctuary attracted 50,000 visitors annually, from school children learning about conservation to researchers studying behavior patterns. Eleanor had become an unexpected celebrity, her story featured in documentaries, books, and academic papers. But she remained most proud of the quiet moments, watching Hope interact with her cubs, seeing Marcus find peace in his work, witnessing the next generation learn to see wolves as magnificent creatures rather than monsters to fear. Tom Running Bear joined them on the deck, carrying the day's mail and wearing the satisfied expression of a man whose vision had exceeded his wildest dreams. The sanctuary had brought economic prosperity to the reservation, created dozens of jobs, and established the Blackfeet Nation as leaders in innovative wildlife management. "Letter from the Smithsonian," Tom announced, handing Eleanor an official-looking envelope. "They want to feature Hope in their new exhibit on American wildlife conservation success stories." Eleanor chuckled as she read the letter. "They want to make a bronze statue of her for the museum entrance. Can you imagine Hope's reaction to all that attention?" As if summoned by her name, Hope appeared at the fence line below the deck, her silver-streaked muzzle showing her age, but her yellow eyes still bright with intelligence. At 9 years old, she had exceeded the typical lifespan for wolves in the wild, a testament to the excellent care she received and perhaps to the contentment that comes from living in perfect harmony with one's purpose. Hope looked up at Eleanor and released a soft whine, not of distress, but of communication. Over the years, Eleanor had learned to interpret the subtle variations in Hope's vocalizations, understanding when she was announcing the arrival of visitors, requesting attention, or simply checking on her human pack leader. "I see you too, beautiful girl," Eleanor called down, and Hope's tail swished once in acknowledgement before she trotted back to supervise her cub's afternoon activities. Marcus watched the interaction with the wonder that still overtook him regularly. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I'd pulled that trigger that night?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. "I think everything happened exactly as it was meant to happen. Your pain led you to us, just like the cub's abandonment led them to me. Sometimes, the worst moments of our lives are actually redirecting us toward our greatest purposes." The sanctuary had proven that thesis repeatedly. Several staff members were people who had arrived at their lowest points, former hunters seeking redemption, grieving parents finding healing through nurturing animals, researchers whose careers had stalled until they discovered revolutionary behaviors in Hope's pack. "Emma would have loved this place," Marcus said quietly, watching his adopted daughter laugh as one of Hope's cubs playfully stalked her through the fence. "I used to think honoring her memory meant destroying the creatures that killed her. Now I know it means protecting the ones that can teach us about love without conditions." Eleanor nodded, understanding the peace that comes from transforming tragedy into purpose. Robert used to say that love multiplies rather than divides. The more you give away, the more you have. As evening approached and the Montana sky painted itself in shades of gold and purple, Eleanor prepared for her nightly ritual. She would walk the perimeter of the sanctuary, checking on each pack member, ensuring their comfort and safety. Hope would accompany her, as she had every night for 5 years, the two of them moving through the twilight like old friends sharing secrets. The media attention had faded, the legal battles had been won, and the initial crisis that brought them together had long since resolved. What remained was simpler and more profound: the daily choice to choose love over fear, compassion over convenience, connection over safety. Eleanor Whitmore had set out to save 4 wolf cubs. Instead, she had discovered that sometimes salvation flows in both directions, and that the greatest transformations come not from changing others, but from allowing others to change us. Hope was waiting by the gate, patient as always, ready for their evening walk together. Dear friends, if you're watching this story and feeling that familiar ache of loneliness, of wondering if your best years are behind you, let me tell you something Eleanor Whitmore learned at 72. It's never too late for your life to begin again. Maybe you've lost a spouse after decades of marriage. Maybe your children live far away with busy lives of their own. Maybe you wake up each morning wondering what your purpose is now that the career is over and the house feels too quiet. Eleanor felt all of that too, until 4 helpless creatures reminded her that being needed is one of life's greatest gifts. Your second chapter doesn't have to be about decline, it can be about discovery. You don't need wolves to find your purpose, you just need to stay open to the unexpected ways love might show up at your door. Whether it's volunteering, mentoring, rescuing a shelter pet, or simply being present for someone who needs exactly what you have to offer, your wisdom, your time, your weathered but still beating heart, remember that your story isn't over. Sometimes our most meaningful chapters begin when we think the book is ending. Share with us. What unexpected joy has entered your life during your later years? Have you ever found purpose in caring for something or someone when you thought your caregiving days were over?